a couple of things about my background since I realized that a lot of the people who've been giving these talks say a little bit about how they came to where they are. Um, Might be premature for me to discuss my life's work as some people have, uh, but it is relevant to what I'll be talking about today. That I come from a background of both anthropology and philosophy. Uh, I I think philosophy was my first, let's say, like academic or intellectual love, and I studied philosophy first in college until I got fed up with what I felt was, well, frustrated with philosophy's persistent inability to understand culture and society. And so I, helped by the fact that I did have an anthropology and the anthropologist in the family, I knew what anthropology was, and I turned then to anthropology, I think, for me, it was a way of doing philosophy better. That's how I thought of it when I first turned to anthropology. So, so when I, so my first degree was, my bachelor's was in both, first was in philosophy, then I got a double major, philosophy and anthropology. Then I went to grad school in anthropology, still doing, I would say, social theory and especially a theory of aesthetics and politics. And then I I ended up in Slovakia because my partner, whom I met in college already, was from Slovakia, so I had this connection. I had visited there for personal reasons, and then I became interested in what was happening with Slovak folklore and how different it was from my experience with folklore in the United States. I'm not going to be talking so much about American folklore in that comparison, but maybe it can come up in the discussion afterwards. Uh, so I did my field work there, and I was living there while writing up the dissertation when a job became available. Well, I was living in Slovakia, and then we moved to the Czech Republic when a job became available in philosophy institute. So I went back to philosophy through this long and I think valuable detour through anthropology. And I still work as an anthropologist in this milieu among philosophers, but I'm in the position of presenting my work to both philosophers and anthropologists, which is an interesting challenge. It means I'm talking out of two mouths at once sometimes, but also it makes me keep thinking about what the other discipline expects at each moment. And so I'm also going to be talking about that a little bit. And now I will share my screen. So let's see if that works. Oh, first I will start the, okay, I started the PowerPoint, sharing the screen. Is it working now? Okay, this you've seen already. Now let me move to first the mention of my book, which I'll be drawing on in for most of what I present today is material that I worked out in more detail in this book, The Paradox of Authenticity, which focused on the moment I conducted fieldwork in 2010 to 2012. But today I'll also be looking back at previous moment, the what I call the regime of authenticity from before 1989, and doing some of the comparative work that was gestured toward in that book, and which I've since written a bit more about. Uh, what I mean by regimes of authenticity is briefly that both in aesthetics and in politics, there is the principle of evaluation in the modern period is connected to some notion of authenticity. And I'll talk later about what I think that means, what authenticity means. Briefly now, we can say that works of art, that is, in the modern period, since the very idea of art being something that emerges in works that have authors or creators, whether those creators are individuals or communities like folk community. There's an idea that the work should somehow express the authentic being or needs of this creator, and that the work should realize its own internal potential. The work should be what it is, should really be what it can be. And in politics, we see a similar kind of evaluation that's made of politicians as individuals who are supposed to authentically represent either their own positions rather than the positions of those who may pay them or force them to say other things, or we expect them to authentically represent their constituents. And then a whole regime is a regime that's grounded on a certain type of type of authenticity questioning, a certain idea of what the connection between this true essence of the creator, the artistic creator, or the people of a political regime, how that essence of the regime should be realized in its practice. So there are continually regimes of authenticity, and these regimes change with time. And I'll be talking especially about the change of 1989, before and after that moment, but also a bit about the period before Communist Party came to rule. And I'll end with some reflections on what I think might be a new change in the regime of authenticity in the last 10 years or so. Throughout, my purpose on a theoretical level is to consider how aesthetics and politics within the framework of authenticity are articulated with one another. I see them as operating, as often taking on parallel structures at moments of political stability, which also translates often into cultural stability, but they can be in tension at moments of crisis. For example, an artistic form might emerge that makes completely different types of claims about authenticity that are in conflict with the the already existing, already dominant regime of authenticity in that location. And I'll be looking through what I see as an ongoing tension between principles of performance and anti-performance that are especially strong in analyzing the communist period of authenticity, which involved a kind of balancing between the idea of performative spectacle in which everyone can take some kind of aesthetic pleasure in seeing grandeur on stage, but at the same time, the claim that the grandeur presented on stage is also a realization and a representation of the people themselves who see themselves on stage and therefore at another moment are expected to take part in this big structure of participation and performance. Whereas in the post-communist period, we see an increasing demand for what I call anti-performative participation, the demand that the critique of the spectacle that doesn't represent us, that makes us only passive spectators to something that should be ours. We see our essence is my own term, but I think it can be it's a good translation for what I took a lot of my informants to be saying, that we see our own selves distorted on stage, or we see the folk distorted on stage, and we want to see the real thing, but that real thing won't be on stage. That real thing will be somewhere else, off stage. In principle, in villages or in the local pub, not performing for anyone else, just doing what it wants to do. In all these cases, we see a kind of circumscribing of the people or the folk that defines, clarifies what exactly this subject is, and that's challenged at the same time, or often at different times. That's periodically challenged by attempts to open up the political, to broaden the definition of what counts as the political or what counts as art, to bring in this popular material that was first outside it. And along the way, I want to suggest, sort of make some methodological suggestions about how I think, from this perspective I have as someone who operates on the borderlines between philosophy and anthropology, that I think both disciplines can inform each other, not only by borrowing concepts and theories, which they do all the time, but also by actually methodologically borrowing from one another. So, for example, when I look at uh, material in the field, the cultural concepts that ethnographers study, I think of them in the same way as I think about texts written by famous or less famous philosophers. I think they can be studied not only as objects of research about which we might say, they show this about this society, but also as ideas that we can be open to, not necessarily taking them on as our own ideas, but engaging with them on the same plane as we engage with the ideas of any philosopher. That we might take them up, we might critically we might critically engage with them, we might call for them to be transformed, etc. At the same time, I think the anthropological method can be brought to bear on philosophy, and we can study what philosophers write the same way we engage in ethnography, by looking at them as ideas that are moving among people in the world, and they're ideas that then can give us suggestions about how to interpret the other ideas by less famous people. And I also take some inspiration from what's become common practice in the field of philosophy, to look at philosophy historically, I should say, especially in continental philosophy, much less so in the Anglo-American analytic philosophical tradition, which is more or less alien to me. But the continental philosophical tradition is also historical. It always looks at how one philosopher responds to what previous philosophers have written. And I try to do something similar with ethnography, taking ethnography to be the interpretation of what is thought at a certain moment in time, this synchronic level, but also considering how what's thought at this moment in time is a response to what has been thought at an earlier moment in time. So ethnography comes in this diachronic, broader picture. And now to come to the main topic of my talk today, authenticity. As I said, I'll get to what I think it means. So now is when I'm doing that. But first, how a wide body of literature as well as discourse, popular discourse about authenticity has taken what I see as two very different, really contradictory approaches to the notion of authenticity. So while many uh, authenticity is perpetually brought up as um, a principle by which to evaluate artists, musicians, politicians. At the same time, there is a tradition of philosophical and critical social theoretical thought that criticizes authenticity, that says the very idea of authenticity is the problem. It gets us caught up in too many contradictions. It's misused in too many ways. We need to just get beyond it, throw it out, think in a completely different, completely new way. Uh, and I find myself drawn to something somewhere between the two, which I think is also what anthropology can do best, which is to not just take up an idea as the proper idea, but also not just reject it because it's misused, but to show how ideas are are culturally embedded, how even something that's an illusion is also true in its specific cultural context. And this embeddedness in cultural context means that it doesn't mean we can't use it because every idea we use is an idea that's embedded and that ideas are always embroiled in contradiction. And what we can do is look for the direction that these contradictions might point us in. But just identifying contradiction might not be enough to tell us that the idea is worthless, since that would be enough to undo almost any idea there is. I I see authenticity specifically as being part of as being something that emerges in the modern period, and and as such, it's not easy to escape without escaping modernity as such. And I don't insist that we'll never get into a new social form in which modernity is no longer around us and authenticity is no longer something that structures our thoughts. But I think that the way authenticity emerged has to do with a society that is still with us. I draw here, among other figures, on the literary critic and commentator Lionel Trilling's book from 1972 called Sincerity and Authenticity, in which he sees authenticity as he traces it to this early modern period and to the rise of industrial civilization, in which uh, both there's rapid change and scale, social scale that feels too big for people to grasp, and changes come too fast for people to be entirely comfortable with them. And there emerges a kind of anxiety throughout society about uh, whether we are whether we really are what we think we are, whether people around us really are what they appear to be. And and this is how I define authenticity more generally, that there's authenticity, despite its varied use, it's about a connection between some idea of essence and some idea of appearance. So it can be about origins, but it doesn't have to be about origins. Something is authentic because we can trace it to the place that it really came from. It's really original. It's not fake. It can be about an inner self versus outer practice. It can be about purity or corruption. The authentic politician is the one that's not corrupt. It can be about autonomy and freedom. Authenticity means being that the subject is has no unnatural constraint and is therefore able to act according to its own inner impulses. autonomously, according to its own laws. Uh, and there are all these different aspects of authenticity, different ways in which it's invoked, but I think they can all be encompassed within this basic framework of an idea of essence and an idea of appearance. This essence doesn't have to be an eternally fixed essence. It just has to be some idea that there's something inside that is more fundamental or more adequate, uh, that's contained in some object than what is actualized in it. So there's this potential in the object that's not realized, there's some obstacle to realizing that potential. Alienation is one expression of this, but the the lack of democratic representation is another expression of this idea. And and because this is so widespread a structure of thinking, I am not sure that we can escape it, at least not very easily. But we can and always do desire authenticity differently. So even though modern society keeps giving us this experience of being inadequate to some kind of essence that we are pushed to feel, even if social theorists will tell us that it's not there and there's no essence, there is this perpetual feeling about it. But the way we react to it, it can change and does change over time. So this gets me to the different regimes of authenticity and modes of reacting to authenticity that I'm talking about today. Very briefly, then, I connect authenticity to, first of all, to this moment when it emerged in the account that I mentioned by Lionel Trilling, that I take up and expand on in my own work. It emerges in this moment of the growth of bourgeois society, which is also a moment when different spheres of society become more strictly separated from one another. It's the spheres that we have now come in general to understand as being fundamental categories of modern social thinking. For example, the economy being separate from politics, art being separate from everyday life, uh, and and the this bourgeois society generated an idea or a regime of authenticity that evaluates subjects based on how they react within these separate spheres. They do what is required by the sphere in which they're acting, and they act autonomously as subjects within these spheres, and they can achieve some kind of overcoming of alienation in art or in some kind of national idea or in folklore, which also emerges as an idea in this same modern period. The next regime of authenticity that I see as emerging in the part of the world where my main research has been focused on is a kind of anti-bourgeois authenticity, which I think should help us better understand communist parties' attitudes towards folklore as something that's much more than a purely instrumental attitude. I'll get to that in a moment, but we can see how they had. I see their idea of authenticity as being a will to integration that attempts to overcome the separations of bourgeois society from the communist perspective. And then post-communist society, again, as a reaction to this integration of the previous regime and a will to renewed separation. And finally, I'll end with a question about what comes next. So what is this regime of authenticity in Eastern Europe from roughly 1945 to 1989? Uh, here I draw especially partly on the book that I mentioned earlier, but especially on an article that's in this book here that came out a couple of years ago, where I looked back a little bit farther in time and looked more at this communist period, communist understanding of folklore. And I tried to grapple with the contradictory attitudes that many scholars bring, and of course, non-scholars bring to the understanding of communist attitude towards folklore, which will sometimes even the same people, but certainly different people will accuse communists of being either too modernist or too traditionalist. So the problem with communist folklore might be that the communists were forcing folklore to be modern, to be about the working class and tractors and to make odes to political leaders. Or the problem with communist folklore might be that communists were purely traditionalist. They just revived the old-fashioned nationalist ideas about folklore and put a communist label on them. And there's nothing specifically communist about this attitude. They just took up folklore because it was convenient. Folklore was popular. It was a way of claiming that they're not just rootless internationalists, they're also rooted in these local cultures. Uh, I think that doesn't capture the importance of folklore in the Eastern European regimes of run by communist parties. I think this also can help us to understand other communist parties, how Chinese communists approached folklore and how American communists, for example, approached folklore, which happened at the same time that folklore was becoming an important thing in the Soviet Union. It was becoming important among North American communists for not exactly the same reasons and in a very different context, but there are certain parallels that we could possibly talk about later. But in Eastern Europe, there was also we have the advantage of having a lot of folklorists who wrote explicitly about why they think it's important to study folklore. This kind of writing is almost entirely dismissed in the post-communist period with the idea that, well, they just said these things because they wanted to please their leaders. But I think that's methodologically highly problematic. First of all, we don't know without really careful analysis when people were just pretending to believe something and when they really believed it. And I think it's much more valuable to take what they wrote and take it as a real idea, regardless of what they might have thought in their internal heart of hearts. So, so we have kinds of statements. I'll just read a couple here that I think are telling. Hungarian. These are statements that were all made at a series of seminars and conferences held in Slovakia, in Czechoslovakia, in the 1970s and 80s, but they were international, so some of the figures are from other countries. So, for example, one of them, Slovak archaeologist and art historian, wrote that the blurring of boundaries by which stylization finds its way into so-called authentic folklore is one of the paths towards the creation of an all-national folk culture. So this already gets us in the direction of how folklore is about blurring boundaries. It's not about keeping the folk separate from the non-folk, but about bringing everything together. Important musicologists, Markl and Karbusitsky, Czech musicologists, they write, it's unsatisfactory to speak of genuine and pseudo-folk music. Rather, we should think of stages in the course of development, and they go on to explain how folklore is a continuation from the past into the present. It's not something isolated in the past. The Hungarian folklorist Ivan Vitányi wrote, "If people want and are able to live in organic and true societies, they will necessarily create forms resembling folk art." And a Czech folklorist wrote that the synthesis of national and folk culture will, in socialist society, become a reality. All of them were responding to this question posed by the conference organizers: what is folklore in modern socialist society? And they come up with these answers, whether they would maybe say them differently in another context or not. Another writes, "In social society, amateur art has ceased to be a passive derivative of high art, because socialist society does not only make all cultural values accessible to the broad layers of working people, but also demands the active participation of the people in the creation of these values." So overall, what we see is this fairly consistent attitude that what folklore should do in this society is be a part of connecting different parts of it, connect the people to the let's say high artists, the educated artists. It should also be about connecting individuals to the collective through this collectively made art. It connects the nation to the international. It connects the past to the present, town to country, intellectual and manual labor. And so authenticity is about ensuring that this connectedness isn't broken, isn't flawed. The essence of the people should be a part of the polity in politics, and the folk should be a part of art. And so I see folklore in this communist regime of folklore as not just a tool to integrate people, or not just a tool to, let's say, use as propaganda, but a tool that actively makes people a part of a bigger structure. And this was done by having, if I go back a little bit, we have these mass spectacles in, you can see, very formal orchestral situations. This is a Slovak ensemble performing in Moscow in 1975. And this is from Slovak Folklore Festival in the village of Východna, which is still going on today. It was, I'm going to read another quote from a Slovak folklorist who said that this festival became the most massive cultural event in the Slovak Socialist Republic, regularly attracting, this isn't his quote, but it regularly attracted 30,000 to 40,000 attendees once a year. And at this festival and at many other festivals and performances throughout the country, you would have both these most professional, most highly refined performance ensembles, and you would have people from villages and factories also performing on stage. I can't see very well this specific ensemble there, and it wasn't identified in the photo, but I'm pretty sure it's not one of the professional ensembles. Yeah, so all of these different parts of a bigger structure would be integrated into a whole, and the expert artists were supposed to help the people, the non-expert people, to improve their art in a similar way as the communist cadres were supposed to help the people to govern themselves better. So you can see there was a certain, the seeds to many contradictions that will eventually maybe contribute to the undoing of this regime. But I think it's important to understand it as a regime that has its internal logic and is not purely kind of pastiche of unrelated pieces. And now this is the moment when I'm not sure if the video will work, but hopefully it will. And I'll be able to show you an example of this. This is a communist era choreography set to the music of one of the most prominent Slovak composers from the communist era. It's performed more recently. Interestingly, two of the performers, the two men in the middle, are men that would later be central to the movement against this type of performance and promoted what they called a more authentic folklore, and were people I interacted with a lot during my own research. But this professional ensemble called Učnica has continued to do the old performances to the dismay of those who think that they should change. And so this, I couldn't find the older recordings, but they attempt to do it basically the same way they've been doing it for decades. That's their explicit goal. And this is based on a folk dance from a village in eastern Slovakia, but you can see that there's no attempt to claim that this is the way it would have been done in the village. Okay, now I'm not sure if the video will work. Okay, let's see. Not sure if I can make this larger. Does it look small to you?
Yes.
Okay, well, you can get some idea.
There's no sound though.
No sound. Okay.
Can you make it larger?
I am not sure about that. That is what I had hoped to be able to do between 7 and 8 o'clock when it turned out that I didn't have that time. I might have to, let me see if I share the screen differently, maybe I can
Okay.
open it in YouTube and play it there. So do you see the YouTube now?
No.
No. Okay. So I will stop sharing and share that. Is it working?
No.
No. Okay. I'll try one more time. But if it doesn't work, then it's okay. Well, here. This should work now.
Much better.
You get the idea. Let's go back to the PowerPoint.
I was just getting into it.
There will be a couple more videos,
Okay.
so don't despair. And now I'll move to the research I did in the field, and how I was talking to uh, growing movements of people who were reacting to what they saw as the domination of that previous type of folklore, which, as I also mentioned, many of them were themselves involved in. So they weren't the people who hated it and would never listen to it, but they had discovered that actually folklore in the villages is a bit different, and they discovered old archival recordings, and they were blown away by just how different it is. Now, this is an interesting moment of different historical perspectives, because when this ensemble Lučnica was formed along with another important professional ensemble, at the time the assumption was we all know what the traditional folklore is like. And a lot of actually most of the initial members, they weren't people who had come up with, say, classical ballet or orchestral musical training. They were villagers who were taken out of the villagers, brought to the city, and given this classical training on top of their experience as folk dancers. And the musicians were Romani musicians who had experience playing one kind of music and were also kind of given more tools to elevate their style by becoming more classical. This was the idea, but there was kind of no idea that we need to preserve this old stuff because it's everywhere. What's interesting and new is to make this new kind of folk performance. By 2010, the situation was completely different. Although there were still people doing folk music and dance in villages, this style had become so popular that a lot of people who were performing folklore and who grew up in cities, even in villages, they were often emulating this style of high ballet influenced and orchestral influenced music. And so the old-fashioned folklore appeared very new to them. And this is the images here on the screen is just an example of the kind of debate that was taking place when I was in the field. Someone made the flyer on the left. They were asked to make a flyer about a folklore event, and then the people who were organizing the event, one of them said, "Hey, you can't. That's not what we're doing. We can't do this kind of flyer for the event. We need to do a flyer like the one on the right, because we're not. This event is called Dance House. Some of you might have heard of the better known Hungarian variant that inspired the Slovak dance house. In Hungarian, it's Táncház. The idea is that people come, they learn how to dance, and they dance without the idea of performing for anyone. So they don't dress up in folk costume, and they're not on a stage. They're on a dance floor, maybe in a pub. The musicians will wear this more white shirts and black pants, which is associated with Roma musicians rather than with the kind of orchestral folklore ensembles that often would have all the musicians dressed as you see on the left. And so this is just one example of how this played out. This is a photograph from one of these dance house events. My analysis of this is that what we see happening is that there's a new kind of regime of authenticity in which the goal is to emphasize the separation between the authentic folk and artistic performers. And I see a parallel between the new idea in politics that the people should be separate from the rulers and people should be free from government, and an authentic or legitimate government is one in which experts govern according to the rule of law. They follow procedures. They don't get involved in meddle in people's affairs, but also the people is not supposed to get too directly involved in politics because that would be populism. So this is the great anti-populist moment of roughly the year 1989 to 2015, let's say, when anti-populism was not always successful at the polls, but was consistently hegemonic in the public sphere. And I see I'm running a bit short on time, so what I will do is, rather than get into the details of that analysis, I'll just quickly illustrate the kind of thing that I saw happening in the field, which is that even though people express this idea that the authentic folk is separate from whatever you see on stage. Whatever you see performed on stage, we have to make it very clear that that's not real folklore. That's a spectacle that might be vaguely inspired by folklore, but it's not the real thing. Nevertheless, and this is the heart of the matter of what these people, why they still had something to do, why it wasn't enough to just say, okay, we have these old recordings or we have old people in villages, that's enough, is that they thought we need to make it so that the public knows about this authentic folklore. So we do need to bring it onto stage somehow. We need to teach people how to dance it somehow. In order to do that, they devised very complex systems of analyzing dance and music to recreate the structures, while also being always careful to say what we recreate is not really authentic. They kept that sort of self-denying authenticity, self-limiting authenticity, as I call it. Now I have these 3 videos. I don't know if there's time to play any of them.
Well, if you can get them done. I don't know that they'll work through the slides, but they might work as separate YouTube videos. If you have them ready to go, it might work. There might be time for it.
I'll try I think I changed something that might make them work here. And then this is really the end, so we can end after that. But this gives you a little sense of, first, another video by Luchnica, the same ensemble I showed before, of performing a Chardash dance from one village called Parchovany. Does the music work this time? Okay.
Yeah, the sound is there. We can hear it.
Okay. Not sure. I don't know. I can't make it large, but sorry. Okay, that was.
Většinu věcí zvládneme snáze společně.
Okay.
Lepší život společně. Unika.
Really wanna talk to you. I really wanna know you. I really wanna.
Okay, that was. So this is one kind of dance. Yeah, I've had to switch to another computer where I don't have the paid YouTube, so I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
This is then an archival recording that people took up in the post-communist period, and almost every folklore ensemble, at least in Eastern Slovakia, but almost even throughout the country, they were inspired by this one recording to do their own version of this dance. And let me skip ahead to the part where the relevant part here. and now recent choreography based on that. It was meant to emphasize just how different they would be doing it compared to the first video I showed. Okay, so that's, sorry, I have to cut those short, but you get some sense of what I've been talking about. And rather than going into the analysis of what happened after that, I will just end by saying that this regime that I have been describing, I see as having begun to break down, especially with the rise of the new legitimacy of the far right, the breakdown of the liberal order in the region. I see it also happening in folklore, but more in the sense that folklore is responding to this by becoming politicized again, reacting to fascism. We have now fascist folklore and anti-fascist folklore. But what the new regime of authenticity is, I will leave open as a final question. And I think we can open to
Sure.
discussion now.
Yeah, and stop sharing screen. That would be good. Okay, well, thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate that. And so now, yeah, as Joe said, let's open this up to everybody now who would like to say something, question. So does anybody have any questions? I certainly do. Anyone? Yes, Sabra, go ahead. You're muted. I can't hear you.
I know.
Okay,
Am I okay
good.
now?
All right,
Okay,
good.
thank you very much. I'm so glad that you invited Joe, and this was really got my brain going around. I just wanted to mention one thing to Joe to see what he has to say about it. I happened to be in France, in Paris in 1983, 84, 83, and I met a Russian folklorist while I was there. This is just some small interlude. And he told me that during the Soviet Union, that one of the ways I was pretty interested in some things to do with the Turkic people. At the time, I read some fabulous, Alan Dundes had recommended to me some fabulous book that I was able to get a hold of. And so I was talking to him about that, and he said, well, what we did, we just, for the heroes, the epic heroes of the Turkic people, we just tried to make the epic heroes be Lenin. I think it was Lenin. Maybe it was somebody later than Lenin. But their idea was that they could somehow just insert a hero of the Russian Revolution into these Turkic epic poetry. Have you ever heard anything like that?
Yeah, there are a few things to say. One is that yeah, that did happen. The other thing is that, well, it's only part of the picture. What the bigger picture from my perspective is that, first of all, this kind of thing happened especially in the Stalinist period. So especially from the 1930s through the 1950s, there was an attempt in lots of parts of the Soviet bloc Soviet Union and then post-war Soviet bloc to create new kinds of folklore, drawing on folk tradition, but inserting socialist content in them. And yeah, you have lots of also Russian epics about Stalin. You have like a version of the Kalevala that ends with the Red Army coming to save the Finnish people at the end, and 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 then also epics directly about Stalin and so on. And what tended to happen is that, or not just tended, but almost everywhere after the end of Stalinism, so starting in the late 1950s, almost everywhere, they decided that wasn't really the best way to go. And what you have is a much more traditional attitude to the content of folklore. There still is here and there some, there are still villagers who will compose songs about tractors in the later period, or write about the collective farm, but there's much less of it. You do have some collections of working class folklore and collections of, let's say, anti-clerical folklore from earlier, like pre-communist period and so on. But overall, the folklore, the idea that even the like official folklorists, those who are creating the discourse and have important positions in cultural politics, they tend to say that wasn't a very effective way of doing cultural politics. Like the best way to do socialist folklore is to make it not so explicitly about politics, but to make it serve this greater function, like the kinds of things that I was reading earlier. What the socialist function of folklore is to bring people together. The socialist function of folklore is to show us what communist society should look like, because it should be a community where we all are able to create freely, and not to directly put Lenin or Stalin on stage. The other thing that is often overlooked, I mean, scholars by now have shown it pretty clearly, but people, especially in the 90s, tended to forget just how much the rise of popularity of folklore in a lot of places, including the popularity of epics in Central Asia, was also promoted by communists. So it's true that communists at certain points banned certain things, but they also promoted this idea of national cultural autonomy, that where these national epics, where they had them, or national folklore, was very much then considered to be something that is consistent with socialist culture.
It's just it's an anomaly kind of to think of as folklore as something that can be imposed, as opposed to something that's from the ground up, right? So, I mean, I see this all the time when somebody, okay, at Ohio State folklore, there's a tradition with the football players for the football game with Michigan that you have to jump in this freezing cold lake the day before the game, and the administration, of course, didn't like that. Something always happened, and so they said, okay. The coach said, okay, we're going to make a new tradition, which seems like very funny to me as a folklorist, that you could sort of tell everyone we're having a new tradition, and then and then no one will jump in the lake anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think both the success and the failures of this communist regime of folkloric authenticity come from the tension in that idea. Because when it was successful, they would say, we actually want people to do this from the ground up. We'll support you, and you will choose which folk songs you want to perform, and we'll teach you how to do it better. And you'll give you the resources to have a band that will come and play for you. we'll choose the band that we think plays music the right way, but you should be like active and participate. And to a certain extent, it was successful in that like as much or maybe more than almost any other area of culture in the region. There were masses of people who joined these folklore ensembles but they didn't have to. They chose to do it. And I mean, sometimes people will say they did it because there was a way of getting a day off work, or they could sometimes travel to festivals internationally. But talking to people who have no particular political, like pro or anti-communist leanings after 1989 will, in my experience, still think very fondly of their time in these folklore ensembles. It's more the people who weren't dancing in them now who don't like the way they did it, who think it was too kitschy and so on. But still, I think you pointed to exactly the main contradiction in the whole regime of authenticity, which was that they wanted people to participate, but they wanted them to participate in the way that in the structure where they had set the parameters ahead of time. And by the late 1980s, fewer and fewer people felt that it was really, maybe in folklore less so, but in the society as a whole, where the same structure was present, they didn't really see this people's democracy as representing their own people.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah.
Don't we see the same kind of thing when we go back to Latin America and we think about how the Catholic Church and the Spaniards and Portuguese and Brazil attempted to control folkloric aspirations of local people, and as they celebrated their traditions, but then the Spanish would and the priests would make a specific day that was a famous celebration of the Maya, for example, and convert it into a Catholic feast day. And that way they would be able to control the development of these folkloric beliefs. At first, there would be uh, a lot of conflict, but as time goes on, the church, and it was very successful in being able to do this, although there are exceptions for it. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about?
Yeah, I think, yeah, which says that this kind of top-down folklore, for better or worse, can be sometimes successful when, yeah, often it takes time, but eventually people end up thinking, I guess it becomes a bottom-up thing. But because it's folklore, and this is what I like about folklore, at least, that it's always unstable, it's never certain. If it's really folklore, that means at any moment the people can start doing something else with it, and the Catholic holiday might still maintain this pagan core and might become something else, or might come out again.
All right. Alice is next. Go ahead, Alice.
Yes. I want to talk about how authentic is it when our archaeologist publisher friend, Mitch Allen, sells Left Coast Press so that Mitch, can participate more fully, almost full time, in a folk dance ensemble, which performs in festivals around the world. And so his participation, Mitch Allen, one of us, wants to spend maximum time performing on the stage around the world in the staged festivals, authentic folk dances. I see a certain gap there in authenticity when Mitch, one of our real colleagues, starts to do this full time in festivals around the world. And I honestly don't know just what kind of folk dance Mitch's group does, but where's Mitch coming from? He's coming from our background. He's got a PhD, right? So just for comment.
Well, what I don't know his work, but what I can say from my own research was one of the things that I found most remarkable was that the people I was working with themselves, despite their criticisms of performance, they also felt that performance was important. And those who were performing also were continually wringing their hands about how inauthentic it was, and yet they still felt it was important to do. And so they were working through this tension. And I so I to me the conclusion to draw isn't that we should never be performing folklore on stages at festivals, but we should recognize the tension that it involves. And I somewhat sympathize with the informants of mine that would say it is important that you don't pretend that what is on stage is the same as what might be played in the pub for fun without any audience.
Well, let me just quickly say I can't resist here is that one of the things that's extremely ironic to me is that it's always frequently anthropologists that are telling Native people what is and is not tradition or what is or is not authentic. And so, maybe Mitch is taking people and, leading. There was another person, I don't remember his name now, about 20 years ago. He was, and I just can't remember his name, who would sponsor various groups, Navajo groups. He would go around the states or take them other places and would introduce their cultural dances or practices and share them. And they would, of course, be paid for that. So I do think it's really, Alice, very cheeky to try and say that, we anthropologists, are the guardians of folkloric tradition.
And in the case I'm looking at, we have this tradition of folkloristics in Central and Eastern Europe where by and large it's the same. People who are not coming to a society that they consider different from them, but people often who have background in these villages, they go back to the villages. So they are treated as sort of the people who are, in some sense, they are kind of guardians of the authentic folklore. And there's a lot of problems and tensions. And for example, I came across that there was a big struggle among the young folk dancers to get the Academy of Sciences in Slovakia to release and make some of its archives that it refused to do for various reasons. And they consider that belongs to all of us. And the Academy said, well, we need to make sure it's in proper expert hands and need to properly finish doing our archival work before we can make it public. So the similar problem emerges even when it's not an outside anthropologist and a native people.
Yeah. Sid, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that we as anthropologists describe performances, music, all kinds of things. And we've already said that these are constantly changing. The role of anthropologists then becomes our data represents what existed before things began to change. I mean, whether you want to call this authenticity or not, we're going back to an earlier period where we've described what people are doing and what we've described then changed. So how do you get into this notion of what's authentic?
Yeah, I think one way of approaching it certainly can be just to say, at least for this specific issue, we don't have to use the notion of authenticity. We can say things were one way and now they're another way. But then the question arises, why do we care? Why is the old way interesting to us? And if it's for purely historical reasons, scientific reasons, then we might say it's not a matter of authenticity, or only authenticity in the very technical sense of claiming that we know what a source really is, or we know we're not falsifying our sources or something. But in a more existential sense, sometimes, well, there emerges this feeling that we desire that older material because something is wrong with the material that's around us now. Something has gone wrong with our current society, which I think is often
Yeah.
pretty legitimate view. And
Excuse me, but the other side is there are some people who would like to show urban elites what people out there do. And the way they do that is through essentially become commercial performances in our kind of system. And so you call this authentic village performances or what? Again, the terminology becomes a problem when you're trying to just convey what goes on.
yeah, and I would say it's worth clarifying that what's on stage is not what we had in the village, but at the same time, still maintaining this.
It approximates it.
Yeah, yeah.
Rick, your hand was up next, and then Jay. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all. And Joe, I know that you have spent a good deal of time not only in Central Europe, but in South America and in the Solomon Islands. And you've observed and collected folklore in all of those places. Those are also very different places. And I'm wondering if you see any parallels between the kind of folklore that you observe in places like Ecuador or the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea.
Well, one big difference is that I don't see either this communist regime of authenticity or the post-communist response to it in these other contexts. And so even though there exist folklore ensembles in Latin America, and there's actually, as you know, something somewhat analogous in the Solomon Islands, these groups from communities that perform at the hotels in capital city, for example, that it's not entirely different from this folklore ensemble that stages what they call custom in the Solomon Islands. In Latin America, actually, it's quite interesting that in Latin America, the whole idea of folklore has different valence than in Eastern Europe, and there's much less of an emphasis on this urban-rural divide. Whereas in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, there's this long tradition of thinking of folklore as something that's rural, and popular culture in the city as not being folklore. Even when the communists tried to push against this, and they did research in urban working class folklore, they which was pioneering, and some of them were doing this before it was very popular in the West, but it didn't get that much traction in those societies. People said, "Oh, that's like a communist imposition," and rural folklore is what stuck in people's minds as being the real thing. And in Latin America, there's much more of an openness to urban popular music being thought of as folklore. So that's a big difference I've seen. And yeah, this in these other regions, maybe more more fluidity and reaction to the tourism industry and commercial commercializing music and dance as being the sort of the big tensions, rather than this tension between state-supported integration of folklore into culture and the opposition to that.
Okay, Jay? You're muted, okay? You're muted. Jay?
No. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I keep getting muted. Okay. So I found this absolutely fascinating talk, in large part because it's opening my eyes to a history that I wasn't aware of with respect to a folklore and folk arts program that I was responsible for and started in the state of Connecticut. It ran for something like 32 years at my institute. And I've written about it, but it looks nothing like this because the setting in the U.S. for folklore folk art is quite different. And the National Endowment on the Arts for many years has supported every state's development of a folk arts program. And most states have them, and we were one of the last to join. But I think my point is that the centers of folklore, folk arts that I've been following, that also include anthropologists as well as others, are very much situated in accessible places, in community locations, sometimes in smaller cities, sometimes in large cities like Philadelphia. In our state capital, our program was located easily accessible, and they take a totally different position. Sometimes their politics vary, but for the most part, their commitment is to make the voices or enable representation collaboratively with people whose voices are not recognized or even accepted or are new arrivals in each state, to be visible. So they have a political agenda, which is essentially inclusionary, shall we say. And also they select which programs and which communities they are working with. Now, the last thing I want to say is that representation is by will of the communities that are involved, not through the folklorist or anthropologist who is running the program. It is a collaborative arrangement all the way, and it doesn't promote folklorist tourism or performances in hotels and so on. It's very much a local enterprise. So I was wondering whether you have a perspective on this, Joe, or whether you've, I know it's not your area, but it does seem to be quite different, and I'm going to be looking towards your books for the contrast.
So definitely there are big differences. One thing that I think you can probably generalize to say that in the United States, there is both less state support for folklore, but also less state structuring of it, and less of this history of the state imposing or at least encouraging certain forms. And so that has led to this situation where folklore in the United States is more varied in its form. It also is, of course, tied to popularized folk music and this politicized folk music that's politicized as oppositional rather than politicized within a support for an existing state structure. And also there's much less in the United States, there's much less of a kind of pre-established system of considering who the folk and who the different parts of the folk are. So I would say that the Eastern European communist system of folklore was also deliberately inclusive in a way. What it did was it tried to clearly define what the nationalities were in a given society, and then give every nationality the ability to represent itself in these folklore structures. But that did mean that if that nationality wasn't you have to be recognized in this way. So, for example, there's a group of people who speak East Slavic dialects in Eastern Slovakia, so that means their language is closer to Ukrainian. The official position under the system before 1989, the official declaration was that these people are of Ukrainian nationality, so they could do Ukrainian folklore. Of course, they still sang songs in the local dialects. They weren't required to translate them into standard Ukrainian, but it was said to be Ukrainian folklore, and they had this structure of the ensemble that they could join. And other people, though, think that they're not Ukrainian. They think that the same people are Rusin, which is another word that refers only to the people from this region and not to all Ukrainians. And they couldn't be represented as Rusins until after 1989, when then they established their own structures next to the Ukrainian structure. So the same group of people had these parallel structures. And there's also Roma were highly respected as musicians, but they were not considered, they were treated as a different kind of nationality, and they were generally employed as musicians to play for the other groups rather than having their own folklore ensembles up until 1989. They had their own theater, but not, it was complicated and there's formal distinctions based on who was a nationality, who was a nation, and so on. So yeah, this kind of structuring was quite different than you find in the US.
Thanks. Sid, you had your hand up for another one.
Yeah, no, it was just a minor comment saying that sometimes in some literature, the term ethnicity is used to refer to this, but I think we're running out of time, so.
Yeah. I would also just say that the concept of authenticity is widely discussed in the anthropology of tourism and heritage. So it's,
Right.
I would suggest reading Ed Bruner's books on most recent, one of his last books on tourism, and getting into the question of authenticity is just interesting. At the same time, it's maddening. It's so complicated. I don't know, Rick, did you want to have one final go before we finish up our time here?
Well, I don't know that I have anything special to add. I guess one thought is that this whole issue of authenticity has been discussed in many parts of the world. And during the early 1990s, there was a series of NEH sponsored seminars at the East-West Center and the University of Hawaii on the whole notion of the politics of culture and authenticity in the Pacific region. Sometime it might be interesting to take a look at the rather robust body of work on politics of culture in the Pacific and compare that with what's been done in other parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was just thinking as you were talking about it now and earlier about the whole idea of the hula dance and how it's been, changed by its touristification at the big hotels, and how it's being, there's an attempt to recover the traditional hula dancing by traditional, my Hawaiian peoples and so forth. So that's just one tiny example of that. So, Joe, do you have any last comment before we shut down today's wonderful talk from you?
Well, I saw there were some comments in the chat, but I will just say that maybe I'll just thank everyone for the questions and responding to the question in the chat about Chinese government's effort at assimilations. I do think that there's a way in which folklore can be used to pigeonhole culture and make it only folklore and make everything else be assimilated. And but I won't give a full analysis of Chinese politics, which is beyond my area of expertise. But yeah, thanks for your great comments and for the chance to give the presentation.
Thank you very, very much,
Thanks so much.
Joseph
Thank you.
Grimm Feinberg. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. And for you taking the time. I know it's kind of late back there, getting on to what, 9 o'clock, 9,